I'm Jess Taylor, the author of Pawls. All of my fiction takes place in a similar universe, so that a character that's in one story or in a piece of longer fiction can encounter a character in another story. And this is part of how we're able to get interplay between the stories. So one character that might be somebody's brother or roommate in one story is the protagonist of another story. That universe is very close to our universe that we live in, but I imagine it is slightly different, especially because it's a universe that, as we see it depicted, is very influenced by characters' perceptions. A lot of the stories are in first-person narration, and that definitely influences the way that the stories are told and what occurs. So even some of my stories, for instance, that aren't in Pawls, that might have more of a fantastical element to it, still can exist in the same universe because it's created by character perception. So the characters of Pawls are people just like you and me. We have a lot of Pawls in there in different roles. And we have a lot of young characters, but we also have, for instance, an old man who becomes young through his obsession and jealousy at discovering a secret from his deceased wife. This is funny because it's a common question that I get a lot, and I think that for me, it's arbitrary, and it's not a real, and part of it is to emphasize the arbitrary nature of naming and of signify or signified in general in some ways. And the other thing too is that I just noticed that I had go-to names that were occurring a lot in my writing, and a lot of these names, they do sort of originate from names of people I knew when I was young. For instance, Paul was a classmate / nemesis of mine. But the character Paul doesn't have any of his traits. He's not like him at all. It's completely insignificant that someone I knew did have the name Paul. As the name was occurring over and over again, I realized I didn't actually know a lot of people named Paul. And so I went out of my way to meet people named Paul. For instance, when I went to Dublin, I started to make a comprehensive list of Pauls, which you'll get to hear when I read a bit. And so my friend and I would shout on the street, "Paul, Paul!" And a Paul would approach us and say, "Did you call me?" And I said, "Yes, I did call you. I'm collecting Pauls." And wrote his name down. I met a Paul from Seattle that way. Another man got down on his hands and knees and proposed to me in a bar in Dublin who was named Paul. So, I mean, really, the thing about the name is that I grew up with tons of people named Jessica, and my name's Jess, and it really means nothing, right? Whether it's that Jessica or this Jessica, the names are just things that we call each other by. Part of the reason why I thought it was really important to talk about was because I saw that it wasn't being talked about as much as was appropriate, and wasn't necessarily being made a first priority when we were talking about equality between genders. And I think that a lot of the time, like, it would be treated as this thing that is monstrous or that is other instead of something that's very day-to-day. And to the extent I write about it in fiction because I think that fiction is the place to talk about it. And I'm not saying that nonfiction isn't the place to talk about it. And what I found really interesting is that there were all of a sudden this explosion of nonfiction articles. And the way that news media works and the way that a lot of online nonfiction media works is that we end up getting a really simplified version of events and a really uncomplicated portrayal. So we get things that are much more black and white. And really, the thing about violence against women, whether or not it be sexual or domestic, is that it is so complicated. And hearing people's personal stories from a real perspective is really enlightening. But I also think that fiction allows us to look at context and to really examine the larger societal problem in a way that we don't really get to in nonfiction. And so for me, it's been my subject matter. It's been really important to me. I especially think with sexual violence, it's been really important to talk about that because I think sex is this weird realm where we don't actually talk a lot about power in sex. And in sexual education, that's not talked about, like power in sex in the same way, except for that consent's briefly touched upon, but really that sex is this place where people explore ideas of power, that people explore ideas about violence, and oftentimes in a way that surprises both partners, that comes out of nowhere. And I think that it's an important thing to discuss and an important thing to examine in all of its facets. I'm just turning 26, so if I spent 5 years writing it, you can imagine I've spent pretty much my whole adult life writing this book. I really even though to be an adult, we say that starts at 18, I really saw the beginning of my adult life being when I was diagnosed with ITP. And so that was in 2012, or in 2011, the summer of 2011. And I started to write my first Paul story in 2010. And so having this blood disorder really informed Breakfast Curry, one of the stories in the book. And it just, it spurred me to move to Toronto, which is a scene that comes up again and again in my various stories in my fiction. We have characters who move to Toronto as this place of hope and excitement, but get met with just more of the same sort of difficulties. So it was a real period, the last few years have been a real time of hardship in a lot of ways. I mean, I was poorer than I thought I could ever be, with $3 in my bank account, but just still so determined to write and make a go of it and to live in the city. And I also saw incredible change in my life with winning the National Magazine Award for Paul, which happened last year, and changed my life in a total way. All of a sudden, I had enough money to eat. I had courses to teach. I had, a job, and the book came out of that as well. I don't think that anybody totally is self-aware, and I think that where this comes out is in our interactions with other people. Because when you're alone, sitting in a room, it's very easy to say, this is who I am. And to think that, even if you're not content with your life, if I had the chance to do this, my life would be like this, and this is who I am, essentially, inside. But when we interact with other people and we do these things that surprise us that are perhaps necessarily not good, and sometimes we might go into something with the best intentions where we're trying to do something good, and then totally it comes out the other way. And I think, or you try and say something one way, it comes out a different way. These are where power dynamics between people starts to play out because of who hurts the other person. And I've never met a person that totally is unflawed and doesn't have these things and in them but that they're not really aware of. And I think in terms of our flaws, we don't always want to look at those flaws, and we look away from them. And then all of a sudden they're revealed to us in these interactions, in terms of, do we take a power stance or do we step back and let the other person take power? Is there a clash here that's going on? And it's a very difficult thing that we go through, but it is one of the ways that we try to know ourselves. These characters, we see them play out a lot of these different things. And I guess I've been told that I write jerks really well. But I mean, it's not that I write jerks really well. I write people that are struggling with how to be in the world and how to exist with other people. And I think we all go through that in some sort of way, right? A flawed person's a beautiful person is a person. Everyone's like that. To what sense that they show it or aren't looking at the hard parts in themselves, it depends on the person and depends on the story. I'm going to read the title story from Paul's, which is actually just called Paul, singular. One street over from Paul lives another Paul. They grew up together and are good friends. People sometimes describe them as inseparable, refer to them as the Pauls or just Pauls if they think they're clever. Paul, who lives on Verther Street, works at a paper mill, and Paul, who lives on Spruce Trail Crescent, became an academic. When the two Pauls were 10, exchanging stories about bike rides and dirty jokes and secrets at the back of the playground, a third Paul was born to a family on the outskirts of town. Paul was a name that ran in his family. His father's middle name was Paul, and his grandfather's first name was Paul, and his great-grandfather's middle name was Paul, and his great-great-grandfather's first name was Paul, and so on. A new Paul was born to the family, and the lights in the hospital hurt his eyes, and the air in the world hurt his lungs, and he wailed, and that hurt his throat. The two Pauls are 25 when this story takes place. One Paul has a stack of books in front of him, and the other Paul brushes fragments of wood from his clothes. New Paul is not so new anymore. He's 15. Paul goes to school, and he doesn't say much. perhaps part of him remembers how wailing hurt his throat. He comes home, and he goes outside, and he listens to the birds. And he walks into the forest, and he thinks about how every day is a new day, a good day, a strange day, and what a world it is that he lives in. He touches the bark on trees, he touches the waxy surface of maple leaves and then touches elm leaves, and tries to think about the difference. Sometimes he collects hickory nuts that have fallen onto the moss at the edge of the forest. He pretends to be a gatherer in a hunter-gatherer society, but he feels too old for such games sometimes. Those times he goes deeper into the forest where his cat emerges from bushes, and he follows her through the forest, mostly just to see where she'll go. Paper Mill Paul has decided to get married. There's money in the bank and there's a girl that loves him, and he's not sure what else to do since every day he drives to work and then he works and then he gets paid when 2 weeks go by, and then he puts the money in the bank and takes the girl that loves him on dates and then goes over to PhD Paul's house after he's drunk from dinner wine. And they stay up all night talking about the things they talk about and doing what they do. So Paul proposes and the girl that loves him accepts and starts picking out dresses. Paul sits in front of his computer reading literary theory, and he is alone and his eyes hurt. There's a girl in Paul's math class that has a crush on him, and she writes his name in the margins of her notebook, Paul, 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 and she tries really hard not to think about his last name, the way it would look after her first name. Besides, her older sister told her the other day on the phone from university that not all girls want to get married, and not all guys do either. Sometimes it's okay not to want those things and to be a strong, independent woman instead. And the girl thought that maybe that's how she should be. But are we still able to love someone and be independent? Of course, it's loving the right way, still being your own person. That's what I have with Rebecca. Don't tell Mom. So the girl writes Paul over and over and walks home behind him with wistful eyes. Paul never looks back. When the girl gets home from school, she writes different things about him, a boy named Paul. She remembers a Paul her mother once mentioned, one of her old friends. She remembers her sister once had a friend named Paul. A comprehensive list of Pauls. Paul, 15. Boy in my class. I like him. He sits across the classroom, and he's really good at math. The other day, the English teacher called on him in class, and he didn't even hear him. He's always far away in his head. It's impossible for me to know where he goes. Paul, 19. One of my sister's best friends in high school. They kissed once at the back of the soccer field, but then he moved away. Paul, deceased. Would be 50. Man my mother knew in university. He got very sick with ALS after he graduated. My mother gets really sad when she talks about it, and then she has too many glasses of wine and goes to bed early. Paul, fictional, 20. Main character in my favorite movie. The movie is beautiful. The colors all have a blue tint. It's about a young man and he falls in love with a young girl even though he only ever sees glimpses of her. The side of her face, her hand brushing back her hair, her back walking in front of him. And follows her through the city, and eventually they meet on a bridge and the sky is blue, the water is blue, the bridge is blue, and even their skin looks blue. Blue, blue, blue. But then he walks away. Paul, fictional, 22. Character in a story I wrote. The story is too much like the movie. I don't want to talk about the story. Paul, 35. First name of one of my teachers, my favorite teacher. I was in grade 5 and he gave me my first adult book to read, To Kill a Mockingbird. It didn't make much sense to me, but I liked the characters of Scout and Dill, and I liked the fact that he thought I was smart enough to read it, even though I probably wasn't. After making this list, the girl isn't anywhere closer to understanding Paul, who he is, his motivations. The next day in class, she sends him a letter asking him to hang out after school. She chews on the end of her pen and watches as the boy next to Paul passes him the letter and points to her. She waves. Paul reads the note and searches out her eyes. His are a faded sort of blue, 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 that don't quite make contact with hers. He nods. She smiles, but he's already gone back to his work. This time after school, she walks beside Paul instead of behind him. I don't have very long, he says. I have a lot to do tonight. Okay. With limited time to really get to know Paul, she starts asking him questions. What's your favorite subject at school? I don't have one, really. Do you have any brothers or sisters? No. I have an older sister, and my mom's going to have another baby soon. She says it's a girl, but Dad didn't want her to get it checked at the doctor. He wants it to be a surprise. Oh. Where do you go after school? The forest. I like being alone. Okay. Well, do you want to grab ice cream or something? They're walking by the local ice cream parlor. Paul studies her again, looks her up and down, wonders what she wants. They order ice cream, and Paul pays for hers because his dad once told him to do things like that when you're out with a girl, especially in this town. It's the way things work. The girl almost doesn't want to eat her ice cream studded with pecans and melting in the warm September sun, because it's special that Paul bought it for her. But she catches the drips with her lips and suddenly has the feeling this might be the last time she'll ever eat ice cream in this uninhibited way. She imagines herself a year from now, 6 months from now, even a month from now, and that girl is different. She is nervous about getting dirty and dripping ice cream down her chin. She wants to be delicate and poised. The presence of the future girl makes the ice cream taste strange, and she licks it up. Paul crunches his ice cream cone sloppily with his teeth, and he tells her about a song he listened to the night before, and how the guitars kind of sounded like light, and there was a violin and it kind of whined like something sad in the background. He tells her because he wants her to listen to the song for some reason, but can't think of the song's name. Anyway, I've got to go. It was cool to hang out. Yeah, she says, still thinking of the song that she'll never actually hear. And she knows that every time she hears a song with quiet guitars and violins, that she'll think that maybe this was the song, and she'll think of the ice cream and being 15 and this moment with Paul. Thanks for the ice cream. And he waves at her and walks down the street toward home. She thinks about going home herself, where her desk is waiting for her. Instead, she waits for Paul to get far enough ahead, and then she follows him.